The automatic doors of the grocery store slid open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air-conditioned air that sharply contrasted with the sweltering heat of the parking lot. Sarah shivered slightly as she pushed the shopping cart forward, guiding her two small children, Emily and Jacob, by her side. Their faces were flushed and sweaty from a long, tiring day. It was nearing the end of another difficult month, one of many since her separation from her husband 2 years ago. Raising two young kids on her own, struggling to make ends meet, had become a constant battle, one that seemed never-ending. As Sarah gripped the cart, her mind raced through the numbers. She had just enough left on her debit card for the basics, no luxuries, no extras. Rent was due soon, and she had to decide between paying the bills or putting food on the table. She hated this feeling, the relentless pressure of trying to stretch every dollar. But more than that, she hated that her children were starting to notice her worry. Little Emily, just 5 years old, skipped along beside her, her eyes lighting up at the sight of colorful cereal boxes. She had just started learning to read and was excited to point out the big, bold letters on the products displayed along the shelves. "Mommy, can we get the cereal with the marshmallows?" Emily asked with her innocent, hopeful voice, pointing at the bright box covered in cartoon characters. Sarah's heart clenched. Emily loved that cereal, but it was far too expensive. She had to focus on necessities: bread, milk, eggs, and a little pasta if she could manage it. Luxuries, no matter how small, seemed so far out of reach now. "Maybe next time, sweetheart," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice upbeat despite the sinking feeling in her chest. Emily's face fell just a little, but she didn't protest. She was used to hearing, "next time." It had become a quiet refrain in their home. Sarah glanced down at her son, Jacob, who was 3 and still too young to understand the gravity of their situation. He clutched a small toy truck in his chubby hand, making soft engine noises as he pushed it along the handle of the cart, completely absorbed in his own little world. As they moved further down the aisle, Sarah began carefully selecting the items she needed, calculating the cost in her head. A gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a dozen eggs. She picked up a small box of pasta and a jar of tomato sauce, feeling her anxiety creep up with each item added to the cart. There was no room for error, no room for anything extra. The store was busy that evening. It seemed like everyone in town was there, filling their carts, moving through the aisles with ease, as though they didn't have a care in the world. Sarah glanced at a woman a few feet away who was chatting on her phone, effortlessly tossing products into her cart without a second thought. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of envy. What must it be like to shop without having to worry about every single dollar? She shook the thought from her mind. There was no use comparing her situation to others. She had to focus on what she could control. With her cart half full and her stomach tight with worry, Sarah steered the children toward the checkout line. She hated this part, the moment of truth when she would swipe her card and hope it didn't get declined. As they waited in line, the noise of the store seemed to fade into a dull hum, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The cashier ahead was scanning items for a middle-aged man, his cart overflowing with groceries, while Sarah stood behind with her meager selection. She watched as the total rang up on the screen, $156.74. The man handed over his credit card without hesitation. Sarah felt her cheeks burn as she glanced down at the few items in her cart. How much would hers cost? $20? $30? Would she even have enough? Emily tugged at her hand, bringing her back to the present. "Mommy, I'm hungry," she said softly. "I know, sweetie. We'll be home soon," Sarah replied, running her hand through Emily's soft blonde curls. She wished she could make everything better, wished she could fill their kitchen with snacks and treats, and never have to say no again. The man ahead of her finished packing his groceries, and the cashier turned to Sarah with a polite smile. "Next, please." Sarah took a deep breath and started unloading the cart, placing each item on the belt with a sense of dread. The cashier scanned them one by one, the beeping of the register echoing in her ears like a ticking clock. Her heart pounded as the total climbed higher. $10, $15, $22. The final amount flashed on the screen, $37.45. Sarah reached into her purse, pulling out her worn debit card, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she didn't have much left in her account, just barely enough to cover this, if she was lucky. Her palms were sweaty as she swiped the card through the reader. There was a long pause as the system processed the payment. "Please go through," she thought, silently pleading. "Please." But then the dreaded message appeared, "insufficient funds." Sarah's heart sank into her stomach. She stared at the screen, willing it to change, but the words remained there, mocking her. She felt the eyes of the people behind her in line. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She was used to hard times, but this public humiliation, was unbearable. "I'm sorry," she said to the cashier, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have enough. Let me just put some things back." She reached for the loaf of bread, but before she could remove it, a hand gently touched her shoulder. Startled, she turned around and found herself face to face with a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, dressed in a simple gray jacket, his expression calm but kind. His dark eyes softened as they met hers. "It's okay," the man said softly, his voice deep and reassuring. "Let me cover it." Sarah blinked, stunned. I can't let you do that." The man smiled gently, shaking his head. "Please. It's no trouble. I'd like to help." Before she could protest again, he handed his credit card to the cashier, who swiped it without hesitation. The machine beeped, and just like that, the transaction was complete. Sarah stood there, frozen, watching as the stranger paid for her groceries with a simple, selfless gesture. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of what had just happened sank in. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." The man smiled again, this time with a slight nod. "You don't have to. Just take care of your little ones." Before Sarah could say anything else, he gave her one last kind look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of shoppers. She wanted to call after him, ask his name, say more, but the words wouldn't come. For a moment, she stood there in stunned silence, her children clinging to her legs, unaware of the kindness that had just been bestowed upon them. Sarah quickly wiped away a tear before it could fall, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. As the cashier handed her the receipt, Sarah muttered a quiet thank you, still reeling from the encounter. She packed her groceries into bags, her mind racing. Who was that man? Why did he help her? The drive home was a blur of thoughts and emotions. Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at her two children in the back seat, their eyes heavy with sleep after the long day. The grocery bag sat quietly on the passenger seat beside her, a simple reminder of the kindness she had just experienced. But even as the feeling of relief washed over her, there was something else lingering underneath, something she couldn't quite shake. The man who had paid for her groceries had vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving her with questions she desperately wanted answers to. Who was he? And why had he chosen to help her, a complete stranger? As Sarah pulled into the driveway of her small, modest home, she turned off the engine and sat for a moment, staring out the windshield at the fading light of the evening sky. The quiet of the neighborhood surrounded her, but inside, her mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts. It wasn't just the man's generosity that unsettled her, it was the fact that she hadn't even had the chance to properly thank him. She had been so overwhelmed in that moment, struggling to keep her emotions in check, that all she could manage was a shaky thank you before he disappeared into the crowd. Sarah sighed, running her hands through her hair, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. She knew she should be focusing on the positives. After all, her children had food for the week, and she didn't have to face the humiliation of leaving the store empty-handed. But something about the encounter haunted her. "Mommy, are we home?" Emily's small voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. "Yes, sweetie, we're home," Sarah replied, quickly pushing her feelings aside. She had to focus on her kids now. They needed her to be strong, to keep it together. Sarah got out of the car and helped Emily and Jacob out of their seats, gathering the grocery bags with one arm as she led her children up the steps to their front door. Their house was small, but it was all they had, and Sarah did her best to make it feel like home for her kids. The kitchen was cramped, the living room cluttered with toys and hand-me-down furniture, but it was theirs. It was a safe space, even if it wasn't perfect. As she set the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter, Sarah couldn't help but think about how close she had come to walking out of that store without enough food for her children. She imagined their faces, Emily's disappointment, Jacob's confusion, if she had had to tell them there wouldn't be enough to eat that week. The thought twisted her stomach into knots, and she was once again overwhelmed with gratitude for the stranger's intervention. But gratitude wasn't the only thing she felt. There was something about the man, his quiet demeanor, the gentle yet firm way he insisted on helping her, that made her wonder if this encounter was just a coincidence. His eyes, deep and almost sorrowful, seemed to hold a story of their own. He had said so little, yet his words had carried weight, as if they were meant to reassure her in a way that went beyond the groceries. Just take care of your little ones. The phrase echoed in her mind as she unpacked the groceries, lining up the milk, bread, eggs, and pasta on the small kitchen counter. His voice had been soft but full of purpose. It was as though he knew more about her struggles than he should have, as if he had seen through her mask of calm and understood just how desperate her situation was. "Mommy, can we have macaroni for dinner?" Emily's voice once again brought Sarah back to the present. "Sure, honey. Let's make some macaroni," Sarah said, smiling at her daughter. She set a pot of water to boil on the stove, trying to focus on the routine tasks of dinner. But as she moved through the motions, stirring the pasta, setting the table, her mind kept drifting back to that brief moment in the grocery store. Who was that man? She thought for the 100th time. Why did he help me? By the time dinner was ready and the kids were seated at the table, the questions swirling in her mind were beginning to weigh on her. She didn't want to let them go unanswered. She needed to talk to someone about what had happened, someone who could maybe help her make sense of it all. After getting the kids settled with their macaroni, Sarah grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to her best friend Megan. "You home? I need to talk. Something strange happened at the grocery store today." Megan was one of the few people who understood what Sarah was going through. They had met years ago in college and had stayed close even after life had taken them down different paths. Like Sarah, Megan was a single mom, raising a young daughter on her own after a messy divorce. They had been each other's lifeline through the hard times, always ready to listen without judgment. A few minutes later, Sarah's phone buzzed with Megan's reply. "I'm home. Call me. You okay?" Sarah wasted no time, dialing Megan's number. As the phone rang, she glanced at the kids, who were happily munching on their dinner. At least for now, they were blissfully unaware of the tension their mother carried. "Hey Sarah, what's up?" Megan's voice was bright on the other end of the line, but there was concern in her tone. Sarah took a deep breath. "Megan, something happened today. Something I can't quite explain." She quickly recounted the story, the struggle at the grocery store, the man who had stepped in at the last minute to pay for her groceries, the strange, calm look in his eyes, and how he had disappeared before she could even ask his name. When she finished, there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Megan spoke. "Wow, Sarah. That's incredible," Megan said, her voice soft with awe. "I mean, I've heard of random acts of kindness, but this sounds like something out of a movie." "I know," Sarah replied, running a hand through her hair. "I'm so grateful, but at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was he? Why did he help me?" There was something about him, Megan. It didn't feel like just some random act of kindness. It felt bigger than that. Megan hummed thoughtfully. "You think maybe he was, like, some kind of guardian angel?" Sarah let out a small laugh, though there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. "I don't know. I don't really believe in that kind of stuff. But I guess it's possible. It's just, the way he looked at me, the way he said, 'Take care of your little ones,' it was like he knew exactly what I was going through." Megan was quiet for a moment before responding. "Maybe he did, Sarah. Maybe he's been through something similar, and he just wanted to help. Or maybe it was just a sign that things are going to get better for you. You've been through so much. Maybe this is the universe's way of telling you that you're not alone." Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, letting her friend's words sink in. Megan was right. She had been through a lot. The last 2 years had been a constant struggle, and there were days when she felt completely alone, drowning in responsibilities and worries. But maybe this act of kindness was a reminder that there were still good people in the world, that she wasn't as isolated as she sometimes felt. "I hope you're right," Sarah said quietly, glancing over at her children, who were now giggling together, their faces bright with innocent joy. Megan's voice softened. "I am, Sarah. Things are going to turn around for you. I just know it." After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt a little lighter, though the mystery of the man at the store still gnawed at her. Maybe Megan was right. Maybe it was a sign that things were shifting, that better days were coming. But even as she tucked her kids into bed that night and watched them drift off to sleep, Sarah couldn't stop wondering about the stranger who had stepped into her life for just a few brief moments and left such a lasting impact. Who was he? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The next few days passed in a strange haze for Sarah. She tried to return to her usual routine, balancing work, caring for the kids, and managing the household, but her thoughts constantly drifted back to that moment at the grocery store. The stranger's face, his quiet words, the way he had stepped in so effortlessly, It all played over and over in her mind like a scene from a dream she couldn't quite shake. By the third morning after the encounter, Sarah found herself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out the small window that overlooked their tiny backyard. The late autumn air was crisp and cool, and the golden leaves on the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Emily and Jacob were still asleep, their soft breathing filling the quiet house. It was a rare moment of stillness, but even in this calm, Sarah's mind was restless. She couldn't stop wondering who the man was, what his story might be. It wasn't just the fact that he had helped her financially, although that had been a blessing. It was something deeper, something about the way he had seemed to understand her situation without needing to ask questions, as though he had seen straight through her carefully constructed facade of strength and calm. She had shared that experience with Megan, but even her best friend's comforting words hadn't been enough to settle the nagging curiosity that lingered in her heart. Just as Sarah was about to turn away from the window and get started on her morning tasks, she heard the faint sound of the mail truck pulling up outside. She didn't pay much attention at first. After all, most of the mail that came these days were bills she dreaded opening, but then she remembered that rent was due in just a few days. She sighed and wiped her hands on a dish towel before heading outside to check the mailbox. The crisp morning air hit her face as she stepped onto the front porch. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly in her thin sweater. The mailbox creaked as she opened it, and her fingers brushed against the stack of envelopes inside. There were a few familiar ones, utility bills, a flyer for a local pizza place, but as she flipped through the small pile, something caught her eye. A plain, white envelope with no return address. Her heart skipped a beat. It was addressed to her, in neat handwritten script, but there was no name or stamp to indicate who had sent it. The paper felt heavier than usual, as though there was something more inside than just a letter. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back inside the house, staring at the envelope as though it might suddenly reveal all the answers she'd been searching for. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly in thirds. Her eyes quickly scanned the top of the letter, her pulse quickening as she began to read. "Dear Sarah, you don't know me, but I saw you at the grocery store a few days ago. I saw the worry on your face, the struggle you're carrying alone, and it reminded me of a time when I was in a similar place. A time when I felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear." Sarah blinked, her eyes widening as she continued reading, her mind racing. "My name is John, but you don't need to remember that. What's important is that I want to help. I didn't stop to talk that day because I know what it feels like to be overwhelmed, and sometimes, words don't fix that kind of pain. But I want you to know that you're not alone. There are people who understand what you're going through, even if they don't know you personally. Years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. In the blink of an eye, my life fell apart, and for a long time, I didn't think I'd survive the grief. I didn't know how to keep going, how to pick up the pieces. But along the way, I realized that helping others, giving back in whatever small ways I could, was the only thing that gave me peace. I saw you that day, and I felt compelled to step in, just as others had done for me when I was at my lowest. You didn't ask for help, and I know it can be hard to accept when it's offered, but I hope you'll allow yourself to take it. Enclosed is a check. It's not much, but it's enough to cover rent for the next few months and maybe ease some of the pressure you're feeling. Please don't think of this as charity. Think of it as a reminder that good people are still out there, and that sometimes, we all need a little help to get through the hardest days." Sarah's hands began to shake as she reached the end of the letter. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't process what she had just read. She glanced down at the envelope and sure enough, there was a folded check tucked inside, just as the letter had said. Slowly, she unfolded it, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw the amount. $5,000. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the check, the numbers almost blurring together. $5,000. It was more than she could have ever imagined. More than enough to cover rent, to buy groceries, to take care of the mounting bills that had been suffocating her for months. Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched the letter in her hand. She didn't know this man, John, but his words struck something deep within her. He had lost his family, endured unimaginable pain, and yet here he was, reaching out to help her, a complete stranger. His act of kindness had gone far beyond just paying for her groceries that day. He had seen her, truly seen her, and had taken it upon himself to lift some of the burden from her shoulders. For a long moment, Sarah just sat there, staring at the letter and the check, her mind racing with questions and emotions she couldn't quite name. She felt a strange mixture of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. She had never expected something like this to happen. In her world, things didn't just fall into place like this. Strangers didn't swoop in and save the day. But John had. And now, sitting in her kitchen with a letter in hand, Sarah realized that this wasn't just about the money. It was about something bigger, something more profound. It was about the fact that someone somewhere had cared enough to reach out and remind her that she wasn't alone. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly, glancing at the clock. Emily and Jacob would be waking up soon, and she didn't want them to see her crying. But this time, the tears weren't from stress or fear. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, feelings she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. As she carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, Sarah's mind raced with a new set of questions. Who was this man, really? Why had he chosen to help her? And how could she possibly repay such a selfless act? But as she tucked the envelope into her purse, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She would find a way to thank him, even if she never saw him again. Because this wasn't just about the money. It was about the kindness of a stranger who had reached into her life at the moment she needed it most. That night, as she put her children to bed and watched them drift off to sleep, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on her shoulders seemed lighter, and the future didn't seem quite so daunting. She didn't know where this act of kindness would lead her, but she knew one thing. She would never forget the man who had stepped into her life and changed it in ways she could never have imagined. The sun streamed through the thin curtains of Sarah's bedroom the next morning, casting soft beams of light on the walls. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange mix of relief and restlessness that had taken over her since receiving the letter and check. The $5,000 check sat in her purse, and every time she thought about it, a flood of gratitude washed over her. But alongside that gratitude was a growing sense of curiosity, an almost urgent need to know more about the man who had entered her life in such an unexpected and profound way. Who was John? Why had he chosen her to help? And more importantly, why did he seem to understand her struggles so intimately? For the rest of the morning, Sarah went through her usual routine with Emily and Jacob, but her mind was only half present. After breakfast, she dressed the kids and walked them to the local park, hoping that the fresh air would clear her head and help her think more clearly. She watched them play on the swings, laughing and running through the grass, their little faces lit up with joy. They were blissfully unaware of the storm of thoughts that clouded their mother's mind. Sarah sat on a nearby bench, her phone in hand. The park was quiet, with only a few other families scattered around, and for a moment, the peacefulness of the scene felt at odds with the urgency bubbling inside her. She opened her phone and began searching for any information she could find on John. There was no last name in the letter, no specific details beyond his tragic past, but Sarah clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could uncover something. Her first instinct was to search for news articles about the car accident he had mentioned in the letter. She knew it was a long shot. There had to be thousands of accidents across the country every year, but something about the way John had written made her think that his story might be known, that perhaps the loss of his wife and daughter had been public in some way. She typed, "John car accident wife-daughter death," into the search bar and hit enter. Her phone screen lit up with dozens of search results, most of them irrelevant to what she was looking for. She scrolled through a few pages, frustration starting to creep in as the results became more and more generic. Still, she refused to give up. There had to be something. Finally, after nearly an hour of searching, Sarah stumbled upon an article that made her pause. It was from a local news station, dated 3 years ago, with the headline, "Tragic car accident claims lives of mother and child, leaves local man devastated." Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked the link and began reading. John Williams, the article read, had been driving home from a family outing with his wife, Laura, and their 5-year-old daughter Sophie, when their car was struck by a drunk driver. Laura and Sophie had been killed instantly. John survived with minor injuries, but his life had been forever shattered. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she read the details. It was almost too much to take in, the rawness of the tragedy, the unimaginable pain that this man must have gone through. And yet, despite everything, he had chosen to reach out to her, a stranger, and offer help. She stared at the photo accompanying the article, a picture of John, Laura, and Sophie smiling together on what looked like a family picnic. John's face was younger in the picture, his eyes full of joy, but Sarah could still recognize the same man who had stood behind her in the grocery store. It was him. She had found him. Her hands trembled as she put the phone down on her lap, trying to absorb the enormity of what she had just discovered. This man had lived through unspeakable loss, yet somehow, he had found a way to turn his grief into acts of kindness. But why her? Why had he chosen her to help? Sarah's thoughts raced as she considered what to do next. Should she try to contact him? Thank him properly for his generosity? She didn't want to invade his privacy. After all, he had clearly chosen to remain anonymous. But at the same time, she felt an overwhelming need to express her gratitude, to let him know that his act of kindness had meant more to her than just covering her rent and groceries. It had given her hope. It had reminded her that she wasn't alone in her struggles. As the kids played, completely oblivious to the emotional storm that was building inside her, Sarah made a decision. She would find a way to thank him. She didn't know how yet, but she would. He deserved to know just how much his gesture had impacted her life. That evening, after putting Emily and Jacob to bed, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. She had learned from the article that John Williams lived in the same town, not far from where she was now. He was a local businessman, running a small chain of hardware stores that had been in his family for generations. He had stayed largely out of the public eye since the accident, but every now and then, his name would pop up in relation to charitable work, donations to local food banks, helping families in need, quiet acts of generosity that rarely made the news. He was a man who gave without seeking recognition. That much was clear. But as much as Sarah admired that about him, she couldn't let this go without at least trying to find a way to thank him in person. She thought back to the letter he had written, to the pain that was woven into his words. He had lost everything, yet he had still found a way to give to others. It was almost impossible for her to wrap her mind around the kind of strength that must have taken. As she continued her search, she came across the address of one of his stores in town. It wasn't far, just a few miles away. Maybe, she thought, she could go there. Maybe she could find a way to thank him face to face, even if he didn't want the recognition. The thought made her nervous. She didn't want to intrude on his life, especially given everything he had been through, but she also felt a deep need to make sure he knew how much his kindness had meant. The next day, after dropping Emily and Jacob off at school, Sarah found herself driving toward John's store. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart racing with nerves. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, or even if she would have the courage to speak to him at all. But she knew she had to try. As she pulled into the parking lot of the small, unassuming hardware store, Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety. She had rehearsed what she might say 100 times in her head, but now that she was here, standing outside the entrance, her mind felt blank. What if he didn't remember her? What if he didn't want to talk about what had happened? Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside. The store was quiet, with only a few customers browsing the aisles. A young woman behind the counter smiled at her as she entered. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the small space, wondering if John was even here. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she considered turning around and leaving before anyone could notice her. But then she saw him. John was standing near the back of the store, speaking to an employee. He looked different from the man she had seen in the grocery store, more relaxed, less burdened. He wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans, his hands gesturing calmly as he spoke. There was a quiet strength about him, a presence that made him stand out even in the most ordinary setting. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do next. Should she approach him? Should she leave? Her feet felt glued to the floor, and a rush of uncertainty flooded her. This wasn't how she had imagined this moment. She had thought she'd be able to simply walk up to him, thank him, and leave. But now, standing just a few feet away from him, the weight of everything seemed too much. Before she could make a decision, John turned and spotted her. Their eyes met across the store, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his expression. His face softened, and without hesitation, he walked toward her, his steps measured and calm. When he reached her, John smiled gently, his voice low but kind. "I thought you might come by." Sarah blinked, taken aback. "You did?" He nodded, his dark eyes steady on hers. "I've been in your shoes before. I know how hard it can be to accept help." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I wanted to thank you. I don't even know how to begin to express how much what you did means to me. The letter, the check, it was so much more than just money. You gave me hope when I needed it the most." John smiled softly, but there was a sadness behind his eyes. "I'm glad I could help. I don't do it for the thanks, though. I know, Sarah replied quickly, her voice shaky. But you deserve it. You deserve to know that what you did changed everything for me and my kids. John nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before he met her eyes again. If there's one thing I've learned, he said quietly, it's that sometimes the best way to heal is by helping others. I couldn't save my family, but I can help people like you. That's how I keep going. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to his words. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to the immense pain and wisdom he carried with him. All she could do was nod, her heart full of gratitude and understanding. Before she left the store that day, Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would carry John's kindness with her for the rest of her life. And one day, when she was able, she would pass it on to someone else, just as he had done for her. The days after her meeting with John were filled with a sense of quiet peace, something Sarah hadn't felt in a long time. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long seemed lighter, and for the first time in years, she could breathe more easily. John's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the best way to heal is by helping others. He had shared his own pain with her, not to seek sympathy, but to show her that even through tragedy, there could be hope. As the morning sunlight streamed through the windows of her small home, Sarah found herself reflecting on their conversation. John had given her so much more than just financial relief. He had given her a new perspective. He had shown her that even in the darkest of times, there was the possibility of light. And yet, as comforting as their meeting had been, there was still a nagging feeling deep inside Sarah, a sense that the story wasn't finished. John's revelation about his family's accident had been devastating, and she now understood why he had chosen to help her. But there was something else, something about the way he had looked at her during their conversation that had stuck with her. It wasn't just compassion or kindness, it was as if he knew more about her situation than he had let on. The way he had said, "I thought you might come by," had felt like more than just a simple observation. It was almost as though he had been expecting her, like he had known more about her life than she could have imagined. As the days passed, this feeling only grew stronger. Sarah couldn't shake the thought that John's help had been more than just an act of random kindness. There was something connecting them, something she hadn't uncovered yet. But what could it be? The answer came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Sarah had just finished picking up Emily and Jacob from school, the routine hum of their day falling into place. She had managed to pay rent for the next few months with John's check, and the relief of not having to worry about eviction had lifted a tremendous burden from her shoulders. She had even begun to make plans for the future, looking into night classes to finish her degree and trying to find ways to improve their situation long term. But as she was about to settle in for the evening, her phone buzzed on the counter. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but she answered it anyway, thinking it might be a work call or something important. "Hello," Sarah said, balancing the phone between her shoulder and ear as she unpacked the kids' school bags. "Hi, is this Sarah?" a soft female voice asked on the other end. "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" There was a brief pause, and then the woman spoke again, her tone more hesitant this time. "My name is Helen Williams. I'm John's sister." Sarah froze, the sound of Helen's name sending a shockwave through her system. She hadn't expected this. She had never met any of John's family, and certainly hadn't expected a call from someone so close to him. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Helen continued, her voice gentle but laced with a hint of urgency. "I wanted to speak with you about John." Sarah's heart raced. What could John's sister possibly want to talk to her about? Had she overstepped by seeking him out at the store? Had she unintentionally caused problems by trying to thank him? "No, it's fine," Sarah replied quickly, trying to steady her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine," Helen reassured her. I wanted to explain a few things. I've heard about what happened between you and John, and I think there's something you need to know." Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. "Go on," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she listened. Helen took a deep breath before continuing. "John has been struggling for a long time. Ever since the accident, he's been trying to make sense of the world, trying to find a way to heal. But there's something about your situation that, well, I think it touched him in a way you may not realize." Sarah frowned, confused by the cryptic nature of Helen's words. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure how much he's told you," Helen said, her voice dropping to a more somber tone. "But I know he mentioned his wife and daughter. What he probably didn't tell you is that, before the accident, they were in a similar situation to yours. Financially, they were struggling. His wife, Laura, was working 2 jobs to try to keep them afloat, and they were on the verge of losing their home. Sophie, their daughter, was around the same age as your Emily when it happened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known any of this. John had spoken briefly about the accident, but not about the financial hardships they had faced beforehand. She had assumed he had been well off, or at least stable. But to hear that his family had been going through something so similar to her own struggles. Helen continued, her voice growing softer, as though she was choosing her words carefully. I think when John saw you at the grocery store, it reminded him of Laura. Of how hard she was working to hold everything together, and how, no matter how much she tried, it sometimes wasn't enough. He couldn't save his family, Sarah. But I think in helping you, he's found a way to save someone else. Tears pricked the corners of Sarah's eyes as Helen's words settled over her. It made sense now, the connection she had felt when John looked at her, the way he had insisted on helping her without asking anything in return. It wasn't just about generosity or kindness. It was about something much deeper. In Sarah, John had seen the reflection of the family he had lost, the wife who had fought to provide for her daughter in the same way Sarah was fighting for Emily and Jacob. For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The emotions swirling inside her were too powerful, too raw. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected that her story would resonate with John in such a personal and heartbreaking way. But now it all made sense. The way he had paid for her groceries, the way he had looked at her with such understanding, as though he could see into her very soul. He didn't tell me any of this, Sarah finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. I had no idea. Helen sighed softly. John isn't one to talk about his own pain. He's always been the kind of person who would rather help others than dwell on his own problems. But I think you've given him something that he hasn't had in a long time, Sarah. What's that? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Closure, Helen replied. I think by helping you, by seeing you fight the same battles his wife once fought, he's finally been able to make peace with his past. Sarah's tears spilled over then, her heart aching for John and the unimaginable loss he had suffered. She had never expected her life to become so intertwined with his, but now, she realized that they had both been searching for something, he for closure and she for hope. And somehow, in the most unexpected way, they had found those things in each other. I don't know what to say, Sarah whispered, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. I'm so grateful to him. I don't even know how to begin to repay what he's done for me. You don't have to repay him, Helen said softly. Just live your life, Sarah. Take care of your children, be the best mother you can be. That's all John would want. He's already found his peace. They talked for a few more minutes before saying their goodbyes, and as Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a new sense of understanding settle over her. John hadn't helped her out of pity or obligation. He had done it because in her, he had seen the echoes of his own family, the family he couldn't save but could now honor by helping her. That night, as Sarah tucked Emily and Jacob into bed, she kissed their foreheads with a tenderness that came from a deeper place than ever before. She had always loved them fiercely, but now, she understood even more how precious their lives were, how every moment with them was a gift. And she knew that John had given her more than just a financial lifeline. He had given her the strength to keep going, to fight for a better life for her children. In the quiet darkness of her room, Sarah lay awake for a long time, thinking about the path that had led her here, the chance encounter at the grocery store, the unexpected letter, the revelation that had tied her story to John's in ways she could never have predicted. And as she drifted off to sleep, one thought stayed with her: she would carry John's kindness with her always. And someday she would find a way to pass it on, just as he had done for her. Weeks had passed since Sarah's phone call with Helen, and though life had returned to its usual rhythm, Sarah felt profoundly changed. Her daily routines, packing lunches, getting the kids ready for school, cleaning up the house, were all the same, yet the weight of worry that had once accompanied every task had lifted. It wasn't just the financial security that John's gift had provided. It was the sense of renewed purpose and gratitude that now filled her days. She could still feel the impact of their connection, of knowing that she had been part of something so much larger than herself. John's story, his loss, his need to heal through helping others, it had touched her in a way that was difficult to describe. And she knew that her life, too, had taken on a new meaning because of it. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning to hope, to believe that things could get better, and that she had the strength to make it happen. One crisp Saturday morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast, Emily and Jacob played in the living room, their giggles echoing through the house. The sound was music to her ears, and for once, the clattering of dishes didn't feel like a burden. It was just another moment of ordinary joy, something Sarah had learned to cherish. As she poured juice into cups, there was a knock at the door. Frowning, Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer it, wondering who could be visiting so early. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a familiar face. John Williams stood on her porch, his hands in his pockets, wearing that same gentle smile she had come to know. "John!" Sarah exclaimed, her heart fluttering with surprise. "What are you doing here?" John shifted slightly, his expression warm but tentative. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I hope it's not a bad time." "Not at all," Sarah said quickly, stepping aside to let him in. "Please come in." John entered the small, cozy home, looking around with quiet appreciation. Emily and Jacob, curious as ever, peeked out from the living room, their faces lighting up when they saw John. "Hi, Mr. John," Emily called, waving excitedly. John chuckled softly, waving back. "Hello, Emily. And Jacob, too. How are you both?" "We're good," Emily replied, her little voice bubbling with excitement. "Are you here to play with us?" John smiled, but before he could answer, Sarah stepped in. "Why don't you two finish your game while I talk with Mr. John, okay?" With a little bit of persuasion, the kids returned to their toys, leaving Sarah and John alone in the kitchen. Sarah gestured to the table, where they both sat down. For a moment, there was silence as Sarah tried to gather her thoughts. "I didn't expect to see you again," she finally said, her voice soft but sincere. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to keep in touch, after everything." John nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But after our conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about you and the kids. About how much your situation reminded me of my family." Sarah swallowed, the familiar emotion of their shared grief bubbling up again, but it was softer this time. Easier to carry, perhaps because they were carrying it together. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds," John said, his voice gentle. "But I wanted you to know that seeing you and your children, it helped me in ways I didn't expect. You gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace." Sarah's heart swelled at his words. She had hoped in some way that her gratitude had given him comfort, but hearing him say it aloud made her realize how deeply they had both been affected by their connection. "You've done so much for me, John," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't even begin to explain how much your kindness has changed my life. You gave me the chance to breathe again, to believe that things could be different." John looked at her with warmth in his eyes. "I didn't just help you, Sarah. You helped me too. Seeing you fight for your kids, for your future, it reminded me of the strength we all have, even when we think we've lost it. And I wanted to tell you that I'm here, if you ever need anything. Not just for financial help, but as a friend." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she smiled, touched by the sincerity in his words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, how much she had been longing for someone to tell her that she wasn't alone, not just in her struggles, but in life. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I did to deserve any of this, but I'm so grateful." John smiled softly. "You deserve it because you're doing your best. And sometimes, that's all that matters." They sat together in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly at peace. Not just with her situation, but with herself, with her past, her present, and whatever the future might hold. As John rose to leave, Sarah walked him to the door, feeling lighter than she had in years. The connection they had forged through loss and kindness had become something deeper, something that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," John said as he stepped onto the porch. "And take care of those little ones. They're lucky to have you." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "And we're lucky to have you." With one last wave, John turned and walked down the driveway, disappearing around the corner. Sarah watched him go, feeling a sense of closure and hope all at once. She knew now that her life was forever changed, not just because of John's generosity, but because of the lessons she had learned along the way, the power of kindness, the strength of human connection, and the importance of never giving up. Later that night, as she tucked Emily and Jacob into bed, Sarah whispered a quiet promise to herself, that she would carry this forward. That one day, when she was able, she would pass on the kindness that had been shown to her. Just as John had helped her, she would help someone else. And in doing so, she would keep the chain of goodness going, long after their lives had crossed paths. Thank you so much for following this journey with Sarah and John. Their story reminds us all of the power of small, selfless acts of kindness, and how they can change lives in ways we never expect. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue creating content that touches the heart. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this story, what part resonated most with you, or how kindness has impacted your own life. And don't forget to share this video with others who might need a little reminder that there is always hope, even in the hardest of times. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to sharing more inspiring stories with you soon.